Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to spend some time talking about this issue of sex education, especially in the public schools. And that has always been controversial, but as you will find out very quickly, there are all sorts of advocacy groups that want to add a whole lot more to what your children and grandchildren might be studying in the schools. So that's why we thought it would be appropriate to spend some time talking with Lori Kuykendall, who's been on the program with us before. 25 years of experience in community health education with her degree from Texas A&M in community health education, and just about ready to get her master's degree in public health from Liberty University. We last time had her in when she was, of course, heading up Aim for Success, which is merged with Just Say Yes, but she is now the head of the Medical Institute for Sexual Health, and we have this press release that you can find on our website. But Lori, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Kerby. It's always a joy to visit with you and your listeners.
Let's, if we can, talk about the Medical Institute, because some of our listeners who have been listeners to Point of View for a long time remember when we used to do interviews. I think that first was back in the 1980s. So this is an institute that's been around for a while, hasn't it?
It has. Dr. Joe McElhaney founded Medical Institute for Sexual Health in 1992, left his full-time OBGYN practice there in Austin to run the Medical Institute full-time 3 years later in 1995, and returned last summer. He did actually at the age of 84 to be the president and CEO, to revamp, re-envision the organization and get us growing and launching back out again into the culture and communities and schools and families.
And again, like I said, 1980s, even before he started the Medical Institute for Sexual Health, we used to interview him because he was kind of the go-to expert when we were wondering about AIDS and STDs and all sorts of things. So that has been a very long history. But now, as you've been involved with this, you actually had a chance to do testimony in front of the Texas State Board of Education. Now, I recognize that some of you listening right now don't live in the state of Texas, but you can learn some great lessons, some vicarious lessons about what you can do in your state. But let's, if we can, explain that to individuals, because there are some things called TEKS, which stand for Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills. And this is something that's supposed to be updated, but it's been a while since they've updated it. So give us the history.
It has been 22 years since the State Board of Education last updated health education standards. So important to understand the difference between standards and curriculum. Standards are standards, the expectations of what students will learn in classrooms that drive curriculum decisions at local school districts. So these standards were revamped this last year. Actually, it started about 3 years ago. A number of a very thorough review process involving national and state experts, local community professionals, and educators, all working together to make this the best document it could be for really what should be another decade or more it should hold for all children in Texas.
And again, these are hearings that last for hours. Now, you sent me the links, and I'm glad that once it's recorded, I can fast forward past some of them, because, I mean, you just got to have the patience of a saint to do this, but it's important because what is happening is a real battle. Now, many of our listeners would understand the issue of abstinence, what's sometimes called abstinence only, and some mischaracterizations that take place. But in addition to that, you have all sorts of other individuals that are associated with Planned Parenthood and SICUS and a variety of others. And they want to get all of their ideas in there. So give us kind of a sense of all the topics that were being addressed there as they were considering those standards and those various kinds of things that necessarily need to be part of the skill set for young people that are going to be in public school.
Well, interesting. So I mentioned these are health education standards, of which 1/6, or there's one of 6 strands, is dedicated to reproductive and sexual health. So then within that becomes standards really beginning at 5th grade with puberty and anatomy and physiology, developmental changes coming through 5th graders, and then on up into middle school, 6th grade, 7th and 8th grade. Health class is not required at the high school level any longer, so it was really important to look at the middle school standards and what would be taught to all middle school children in Texas. So beyond just puberty and anatomy and physiology, there were extended information, comprehensive information, as I like to say, actually, about healthy relationships, communication, setting boundaries, refusal skills, sexually transmitted diseases, preventing pregnancy, STDs, STIs, and also an important ad we saw was the emotional risks of early sexual activity.
Let me just mention, too, that if you find yourself saying, I'd like to get some of this information because I'm fighting this same battle in my school district, you can go to Medical Institute, or else it's medinstitute.org. We do have a link there, and if you can click on the picture there of Lori, it will take you to that website. And I think you're going to find some of that very helpful because there are free materials. There's a store for some of the books. There's videos and a variety of other issues. And just before we get into some of the other specifics, I thought maybe I'd set the scene by the fact that when we deal with this issue of sex education, it does seem to me, Lori, that the stakes are higher than they ever were. Since I'm the old guy around the table, maybe not as old as Dr. McElhaney, but pretty old, I can remember a time growing up in the San Francisco Bay Area in Berkeley where there were concerns about STDs. But there were really only 2 that we ever talked about. Both of those were curable with various kinds of antibiotics. Now, we can all debate on how many there are, but at least 3 dozen I think most people will agree with. Some of them are not curable, some are fatal. So the stakes for sex education are higher, I would think, than they've ever been before. What are your thoughts?
Absolutely. The Centers for Disease Control says we are in an epidemic. Of course, we're talking pandemics, but an epidemic of STD or STI infection, growing increasingly among young people. About half of all infections are in young people under 25, and that's millions and millions that we know of each year. And yet so often, because STDs are most often asymptomatic, people aren't aware they're even infected and continue to spread them through sexual activity, we continue to have an increase. I would say it's interesting, though, while STDs are raising and continue to raise to these epidemic levels, the pregnancy, birth, abortion, and sexual activity rates are not increasing.
I thought that's interesting.
They've been at a decline for the last 20 years, reaching some of their lowest points ever. And there's a number of different complex reasons why we see those numbers, some things going down, STDs going up, and really, to me, it shows clearly that sex is more dangerous now than it was before. Also shows that young people, we haven't studied and learned all the kinds of sexual activity they're involved with that may be putting them at risk that may not be captured in particular questionnaires or surveys. So we have a lot to learn to figure out that dynamic. But it's an important part of this conversation because many of the groups advocating for what is called comprehensive sex education, more on contraception, more on abortion information, would uphold that those rates are getting worse when really they've been getting better for the last 20 years.
Let's take a break. When we come back, maybe give a parental advisor because we're going to get into some of the specifics. And frankly, maybe you might want young ears to hear these, but if you have a young person at home right now, especially during this Thanksgiving week, it might be a good time for them to listen in and learn a little bit more. We'll talk about all that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
James Meigs, writing in the City Journal, talks about what he calls the chump effect. He's not the first to use the phrase. Andrew Ferguson coined the phrase years ago to deal with a different issue, but James Meigs uses it to illustrate how many of us feel like chumps when we follow the rules and see others succeed when they break the rules. You know the feeling that he describes. You're inching forward in the freeway exit lane, and another driver flies past and swerves onto the ramp at the last second. Your child has to complete her college entrance exams within a designated time period, while your neighbor's child gets twice as long because of a suddenly diagnosed learning disability. You pay extra to have your pet travel in the airplane's cargo hold and then sit across from a yipping dog who gets to ride on an owner's lap because it is an emotional support animal. He reminds us that thousands of norms, rules, and traditions make civilized life possible. Some, like paying taxes and not littering, are enshrined in law. Most of us follow the standards of etiquette and certainly follow the law. But here are some important questions. What happens when more and more people break the rules? What happens when political leaders break their own rules? These are no longer hypothetical questions. Governors and mayors have been caught violating their edicts, and most of them merely try to justify their actions. A number of district attorneys have decided not to prosecute people who don't pay transit fares and not prosecute shoplifters who steal less than a few $100s. Those of us who follow the rules will start feeling like chumps, and it's only a matter of time before more and more of us start wondering why we play by the rules. If those guys don't have to play by the rules, why should we? This is a prescription for anarchy and lawlessness. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Lori Kuykendall with us today, and we're talking about the Medical Institute for Sexual Health and these what are called TEKS, Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills, which is part of what is actually put together by the State Board of Education. By the way, we've talked about that with Dr. Ray Boland in terms of origins and things like that. So these are in all sorts of different areas, but these have to do with the health issues. But Lori, for just a minute, since we are talking about what was happening in Texas, I have noticed a lot of national focus on what happens in Texas. National issues. New York Times has written about this. There have been a number of things, I think NPR and some others. So why is this important beyond just this one state of Texas? What's going on?
I think for several reasons. I'm glad that you asked, because I think that people have seen Texas as this, very conservative, put whatever the labels you want to add into there in a political climate. And with that has been our long-held focus on abstinence education. With that also has come some pretty alarming statistics about where we rank in teen pregnancy. We're the highest for repeat teen births. So there's a lot of interest in Texas. We're also a big state. 5.5 million children in Texas schools drive textbook markets nationally also. Mm-hmm. So I think people are concerned about what we're teaching here, because what is taught will be what is bought.
Yes.
There's also a concern and an interest over what many would say the abortion industry and dollars that would follow when more information is available, resources given, referrals made for children to some of the abortion providers and other contraception and family planning clinics and such in the area. So it's very interesting and contentious, as you can imagine, the last 15 months have been.
Anybody that would like to find out more, they can find some of the links there, and it gets a little contentious. And you've got various groups in here. One, I'll just mention this in your press release, Power to Decide. That came originally from a group that was called the National Campaign to Prevent Teen and Unplanned Pregnancy. And they talk about this idea of consent. Now, who would be against consent? You know, the advocates for youth define consent as both people are actively willing to engage in sexual behavior, and yet that became a big issue. So talk about this idea of consent. What does that mean?
Well, I think Webster's dictionary would help us out even here on a fundamental level. Consent is to affirm or to assent, give approval for, right? It's a moving towards something. And it's important, if we're going to help young people avoid sexual activity, to move them away from that activity. So we use the term refusal skills instead. And what's even more concerning, if you look at some of the national curriculum providers who would like to be, bought here in Texas, it's easy to find concerning videos and role play activities, which are basically helping young people learn to negotiate for sexual activity. So these awkward, uncomfortable, really sexualizing conversations, activities, and videos in a classroom are not benign. Many have said consent prevents sexual abuse. How does saying yes prevent saying no to sexual abuse, right, is one thing I've tried to simplify for people in there, because consent sounds like a great idea, but yet when you see the curriculum activities, the way it's intended to be taught, it is harmful and sexualizing, normalizes sexual activity for kids.
Well, and again, a lot of what you're talking about is the idea of sexual risk avoidance. In some respects, we have to come back to something we just mentioned a minute ago, and that is, even as we've been in this broadcast, if the statistics are right, some individuals have picked up STDs even in the short amount of time you and I have been talking about, because the numbers are off the charts. And so if we want to prevent young people from getting an STD that may be with them for the rest of their life, that could completely destroy their life, or that they end up getting pregnant and then as a result have to decide whether to keep the child or go get an abortion and all the other aspects, there is some wisdom in recognizing that sexual risk avoidance, or what we call abstinence, is a very important thing that if we don't teach it, young people are going to be taking their cues from the culture, and that's not necessarily very optimal in terms of their health, is it?
Well, I think it's all in the direction and the single message approach, right? Young people need clear, directive messages to help guide them towards healthy decisions. So, and it's not just pregnancy. I think we've got to be careful. As you already have said, we've talked about STDs and emotional and mental health. Many of the groups that get involved are just looking to prevent pregnancy. We've got some pretty great ways to prevent pregnancy, actually, but not STDs and not the emotional and mental harm as well. So a few years back, we coined a new term in this movement, sexual risk avoidance. People had said abstinence doesn't work. Well, what part of abstinence doesn't work? I've heard people say it works every time, really. But really the approach. And there's a controversy over what really works to prevent the behaviors that put kids at risk. And we do a lot of research and look at a lot of research around the different approaches, what has really mattered. And there's been really a debate, a dialogue, misunderstanding and confusion in the media over what works. So abstinence only, abstinence based, abstinence plus, abstinence focused, it's all very confusing, and people use those terms differently. To me, it's all about the direction of instruction for children, giving a clear message to kids that the best thing they can do to protect their sexual health is to wait until marriage.
Now, one of the things that you and Dr. McElhaney and others have been a part of is a coalition for a new sexual revolution, because you recognize that we don't need to be looking at just what you're doing here in the state of Texas, because you have friends all over the country, all over our listening audience that can be part of that. So what does that mean? Because that's another aspect of something that you've coined a kind of a term and an organization, sort of unofficially, to begin to put together a coalition to speak this issue all over the country.
Well, I think when we look at our culture, there's truly a wave, continued growing wave from the first sexual revolution, where sexual messages, sexual pressure, sexual images, the culture is flooding our kids, pushing them to become sexually involved, normalizing sexual activity. when we look at things like the progression of gender identity and sexual orientation, when we look at the progression of pornography, a number of concerning issues really come back to that root of keeping sex within its intended context of healthy marriage. So we do have friends across the country that Dr. McElhaney has pulled together, and we're looking at really strategies to help change the culture on a bigger scale. Friends who are working on pornography, working on abortion, working on the sexual orientation and gender identity issues, all to come back to how can we really grow healthy children and healthy families by upholding a healthy marriage as the optimal context for sex.
Now, that kind of gets us also into some of the press releases here. One saying teaching non-abstinence birth control gets preliminary okay, but does not include gender identity, sexual orientation, because a lot of what was here had nothing to do with what we would think would be even the issue of sex education, but had a lot to do with trying to promote the LGBTQ agenda, wasn't it?
There was a lot of pressure really around two issues, the LGBTQ inclusive instruction, and then also this consent education, as we've talked about. And I can clarify on the LGBTQ issue that sexual risk avoidance, avoiding sexual risks, is for all children, that it is inclusive, absolutely. And we know that when we're writing standards for children in classrooms, especially elementary classrooms, even the adults are confused about terminology and language and expression and identity and orientation. All of those complicated concepts are best taught at home, where families can pass on their values to their children. So we kept differentiated instruction for those students, although it was demanded for and called for by many. Perhaps most disheartening to me was the young people saying, I identify as a gay or lesbian person, and I wish I had learned how to have sex in the way that I want to, and things like that, which were just so concerning the children. I saw a testimony this week of a 7-year-old who wanted information on being transsexual. So we decided that it was best for all students to avoid sexual risks, and we wrote inclusive health education teaks for students.
I don't mean to be crass, but I saw something the other day where somebody said this third grader said that he wanted to change his sex, and he said, in the third grade, I was still kind of wondering what sand tastes like, I mean, we're talking about children at very young ages being encouraged to do things by adults or making decisions that they may regret for the rest of their life. So I want to take a break, but when we come back, I want to open up for questions that you might have, because after all, you may have been dealing with this in your own situation. Maybe you wonder what to say to your own kids. We haven't even gotten into the whole issue of pornography, sexting, and a variety of other things, which I know that you have addressed in the past as a speaker there at Aim for Success, Now Just Say Yes. And so there are all sorts of other topics we want to put on the table. And of course, we haven't talked about contraception and condoms and all sorts of other things. So there's a lot more to cover, but I wanted to give you a chance. Maybe you've always wanted to ask a question of an expert. We have Lori Kuykendall with us today, and feel free to give us a call. That number is 1-800-351-1212. We're talking about sex education in the public schools. We've been talking about this ever since Marlon Maddox started doing some of those interviews with Dr. McElhaney back in the 1980s. But the world has changed dramatically, and that's why we wanted to give you an update, and I think you'll have a chance to hear that. But if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. In studio with us today, Lori Kuykendall with the Medical Institute for Sexual Health. And how have you been able to respond to the argument that you hear all the time, and that is, well, this is great. You know, certainly some young people want to be taught how to abstain from sex. That's good. But how do you address the issue of, well, we shouldn't be teaching it in the schools at all? Because as I understand, there was at least some pushback from people saying we shouldn't be teaching that in the schools at all. How do you respond to that?
Absolutely. I thank you for bringing this up. We did have some who may be like-minded with you and I in a number of ways say this shouldn't be taught at school. It should be taught at home in the family. And absolutely, families and parents should be the primary sex educator of their children. My background in health education upholds teaching children how to be healthy to help them do better in school also. So from that background, from a place of health and science, we've known that teaching children about health, which includes sexual health, age-appropriate, medically accurate, culturally relevant, all of those things in a way that impacts their lives, helps them do better in school. So I would say, yes, teach your children at home, please, and allow us to teach the kids at school who aren't getting this good information. And that's a lot of them. And so there are certainly lots of misinformation in our world. I think we have an opportunity in a school classroom to bring them life-giving truth in a way that, again, medically accurate, age-appropriate, and upholds many parents' value as well. Of course, in Texas and in most states, there's the right to opt out of classroom instruction.
Right.
And I think that should be upheld, and parents should have the right to not have their children participate in sex ed or any other kind of ed that they don't want their children being taught. But I think overall, we've came to such a good place of good health education standards for the kids in Texas that will affect kids all over the nation.
So I talked about one extreme. I don't want anything taught in the public schools. The other extreme is, oh, well, Lori, you're just naive. They're just going to be young kids that are going to get sexually involved anyway. So we need to teach them how to put on a condom. We have to teach them how to use contraception. We need to teach them all sorts of things. How do you respond to that?
Well, I appreciate the other side as well, right? There's kind of always a trick and a challenge here. I think part of it comes back to what is best for kids and also really looking at sexual activity rates among young people. It is a myth, a fierce misconception that all kids are having sex. We even help the young people understand that. Most teenagers don't have sex. Centers for Disease Control verifies that in every state in the United States. So they track that, and as I shared earlier, that rate has been going down and down and down. Fewer kids are having sex on a national level as well. And we can talk about why and what they may be doing instead and some of those concerns, but most kids will wait. And the other part of that is just like with academic standards, we uphold what's best for children. All kids go to college. All kids pass their grades. All kids are expected to do this, and this academically. And I think it's the same kind of unified, consistent messaging in health that should be upheld too. We don't teach them don't smoke and don't drink, but oh yeah, by the way, here's a filter if you want to not get as much nicotine in or whatever, on drugs and alcohol. If McDonald's wants to sell hamburgers, they don't say ours are great, but here's you might check out Burger King's also. I like to use that illustration because people say the abstinence but message is a good one. I say abstinence but is not clear. It's abstinence, sure, but go down the road and sex would be fine too. So I think we want to give a clear, consistent message, a primary prevention message, as the Centers for Disease Control calls it.
Yes. And again, I've seen some studies that have said, well, if they're using these devices, these are very effective. But then if you read the fine print, it's when they're used correctly and consistently. You have kids, I have kids. I can't think of my teenagers, and the words correctly and consistently fit very well with their behavior. So that's something to think about. But let's, before we go any further, take some phone calls. So we'll head out to California first. And let's see, I got to push the right button there, which is, I'm just learning this new system. There, Michael, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yes, I may have missed some of this discussion. I'm a psychologist out here in Northern California, and several of us have tried to, kind of oppose some of the massive numbers of bills that the Democrats in Sacramento have been pushing, and to no avail. California Family Council even gave hundreds of Schreier's book out.
Schreier, yes.
Yeah. and they don't. It doesn't seem to be make a dent. And I just wonder what Lori had to say about the political aspect of all of this.
Okay, Lori?
Well, one thing I like to say, we've been most successful keeping the argument in a public health perspective with health data from the Centers for Disease Control and other nationally recognized sources. As I like to say, take away politics, morals, and religion. Let's look at it from a health perspective. We also know when the elephants fight, the grass loses. And sometimes in all of that battle and all the discourse, there's just a lot of confusion that happens. And politics, morals, and religion play into it for sure. But can we come to the table of looking at from a health perspective? And then also a second strategy that has been effective is involving parents, and lots of them. We call it a tsunami strategy, where you get as many parents involved, and sometimes that's from church groups, scout groups, whoever groups there are. Many parents are simply sort of in the dark, aren't aware of the concerning kind of content being proposed. So know what's being taught, know every word, every slide, every video that your children will be taught. And when there are communities that are wanting to oppose a particular curriculum or particular laws, expose those kinds of dangerous messages and what they're really trying to teach children. A lot of people are just ignorant and need to be brought into light on what's being proposed and gathered with others to oppose it.
Let's, if we can, talk about what is available at the Medical Institute, because for Michael or other individuals, wherever they might be located around the country, that gets back to, I think, the genius that Dr. McElhaney brought to the focus, and that is to recognize that we don't have to even use religious arguments, political arguments. We can just use health arguments. And if you go to medinstitute.org, don't even have to remember all that, just simply go to Point of View and click on the picture next to Lori. You'll find, first of all, a lot of view-free materials that are available. And so you can find some of these various articles, some of the posts. There's a store that has some of this material. And I know that over the years, these infamous slides that Dr. McElhaney put together have been used even in our own context many times, just to help young people and adults and most importantly, school administrators recognize what is at stake. If you really had good, accurate information about the number of STTs, the kind of impact that this is having on young people, the life-changing impact that it's having on some, just the health issues alone coming from the CDC and others are enough to really make your case. And if at that point people are going to simply reject it, then you can use a line that's used against us all the time. Follow the science, because the science is really on one side, and that is to recognize the incredible danger to young people as they get sexually involved with one another.
Yes, and I was also thinking, Kerby, that we would need to look to us to help. So that's what Medical Institute does. So we had calls come in recently from Utah, Vermont, New York. That's what we're about, is really what we call it influencer-focused leadership, helping the influencers, which it sounds like your caller and others may exactly be in that place where we could help parents and community activists have the information they need to go forward. We've got some good strategies along with the science that can help make a difference.
You know, I talked about young people. I know we're coming to a break, but I've said before, you have daughters, I have daughters, that young girls are even more vulnerable as a group than any other in terms of sexually transmitted diseases, aren't they?
They are, from a chemical, biological, physiological perspective. Also, they're more susceptible on some of the emotional and mental health issues as well, and they carry the greater burden with pregnancy. So we definitely want to uphold the value of girls and the value of waiting.
It's another slogan, don't, protect the girls. We right now have the hashtag Me Too movement. We've had concerns about sexual predators and all the rest. Well, this is just one more issue to address there as well. Let's take a break, though. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to know more about the Medical Institute for Sexual Health, we have this press release that gives you kind of a summary of some of the things we've covered. But if you find yourself saying, I really want more information, I might even want to buy a book or or two. Well, those are also available at the website, and so we'll talk about that in just a minute. But if you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. We'll wind down our conversation today with Lori, but I just wanted you to be able to ask her a question or make a comment, so feel free to do so. Visit our website, pointofview.net. We have all the links that you need, and we'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back in a few more minutes. Lori Kuykendall with us, and if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Let's head back out to California again. Shelley, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hi.
What would you like to add to the conversation?
Well, I love the idea of you protecting the girls. I love the movement idea. I'm kind of on the other side of the spectrum. I have an autistic son. He can be out of control sometimes. He's about 5'5" at age 11. He's going to be a big boy. So we always get birth control for girls. Why don't we do something like get a shot for the boys? Like, is there anything out there to give boys some kind of birth control? Because my son, I don't know what his future is going to be right now. But all I can say is I wish that there was some way that he can be having some birth control so I don't have to worry about his genetics. I had tested. He has something called a BBS10 gene. So if he ever decides to have kids, he needs to make sure that that girl does not have BBS10, or they're going to have babies that have weird toes. So I know there's things wrong with them. So I need to see if there's anything is going on for a boy to get some birth control shots.
Okay. Any thoughts about that? I don't know much about that.
Well, a couple of things we talk about a lot in this discourse is the difference between classroom instruction and counseling intervention, right? So much of what we've been talking about today is for a classroom environment where
Right.
you're teaching all children. And it sounds like this caller has specific needs that would be more better dealt with in a clinical or counseling intervention kind of situation. I am aware of some beginnings of hormonal contraception for males that are out there, but I think it's, again, not such a simple answer either in terms of complexity of STDs and all of the other behavioral and emotional and mental health issues involved. So it would be tricky to answer in our environment today, but I think it raises a concern. I actually just heard last week some data looking at how autistic children are being sort of drafted into the
Yes.
transgender movement. They are susceptible to some of these ideas in terms of a new way to get attention or a new way to, you don't fit in that body, try this body kind of ideas. And I think that's something to be aware of too, and to continue to uphold truth and design and all of those. It's complex. I feel for this listener. And work with moms at our church that deal with special needs children. It is very hard. So I wouldn't want to try to give a simple answer by any means, but I think there's a number of issues to be dealt with there. And I appreciate the call.
We just talked about transgender a minute ago with Michael and Abigail Shire, who's been on the program and now has been blocked and all of that. But I've oftentimes said that people always say that a picture's worth 1,000 words. No, a graph is worth 1,000 words. And you've got a graph, if I remember right, that actually shows how there's been this explosion in transgender, but it isn't that there are more kids that are transgender. It is that there's social media that plants those ideas. And so you have this kind of rapid onset gender dysphoria that we were talking about with her. And in some respects, what we're dealing with now in terms of sex education is happening outside of the classroom. It's happening in the social media, isn't it?
The cultural messages are strong. That wave, that tide is pushing hard against our kids to mold them away from their true identity and to explore and try different things and be swept into different social identities, different communities. Families will take you in if you want to be different than what your family thinks you should be. It's really getting scary out there to me in a number of ways. I think we've got to continue to come back to science, as we've said before. And as you reference this chart we have that speaks to the tidal wave of social media that has kind of brought kids out to these identities. And we're beginning to see even in places like Europe where those that transition to another gender are now kind of coming back. I'm afraid we're in a time of social experiment where we really don't know what all the fallout of it will be. But I do hope we'll curb back to health and male and female and upholding what's best from a sexual and reproductive health perspective.
Yes, so transgender regret is something that's been talked about before. But one other aspect of social media, and I know you've spoken to this before, the availability of pornography as well as sexting and some of the things I know you've spoken about in some of these classrooms. This is just a much more difficult time for young people growing up, and a lot of that has been facilitated by these cell phones, hasn't it?
Yes, technology is both a tool for good and a tool for harm. And I think just like we train up our children to handle fire appropriately, which again can be for good or can be for harm, parents must be involved in helping technology be used for good. We can't throw it away. We can't keep kids off of devices, but we can help them make good and healthy decisions navigating this scary world and many pressures, lies, misinformation out there, and turn those for good.
Let's, if we can, talk about some of the resources that are available at your website, because you have all sorts of brochures and things of that nature, some about the brain. Matter of fact, I've said before to Dr. McElhaney, I learned so much more about brain studies, first from him. Of course, now we have all sorts of people doing studies on what is called neuroplasticity. His book on Hooked, brain science, on how casual sex affects human development. And you've got some various videos and DVDs and a variety of others. So these are parents out there. In some cases, there may be teachers listening right now. There may be pastors saying, okay, I need all the information I can get. So what will they find when they land at the website?
Well, I would recommend they check out our brand new STI course. Really, it's an online, self-taught 2 to 3 hour time frame for you to really get the lowdown. The latest on sexually transmitted diseases would be my greatest recommendation, fresh and hot off the press. And then our brochures are on sale right now. We're selling them in packs of 50. Happy to let you take a look at those. And of course, our team, our science team, and myself are available as you all need input, speakers for certain events. Those kinds of things where we want to be a resource. We've testified at the Texas State Board of Education. We're happy to present at conferences, happy to help those who are testifying in their areas also.
I just mentioned, too, you have an HIV video in case anybody would want to watch that. But most importantly, on the lower right-hand corner, join our newsletter. So there's a way if people are saying, okay, I just need some kind of day-to-day information. Maybe I'm trying to figure out what I can say to my children or my grandchildren, or I'm wondering about what I can take to my school board, or I've got some real questions about what might be taught in these classes. That's a way in which they can kind of keep up to date with you, isn't it?
Absolutely. Newsletter just went out today, and if they sign up, I'd be happy to get them the one that went out today.
Well, very good. Before we wind down for the day, let's talk about that, because you also have a number of posts, some tweets. The featured video at the moment deals with this whole idea, isn't it just sex right? So, again, this would be something that you could say, maybe I'd like to forward that to my kids or my grandkids, or maybe the parents of kids that I know are there. So there's some resources that you could also use in a way to have an influence, isn't there?
Yes, we want to make it easy for parents to speak into this, for parents to know the great power they have over shaping their growing children's and adolescents' brains, especially as you've said. I think grandparents are really kind of at a loss of how can we save our kids, save in this scary world. And yet there absolutely is truth to be told and guidance and support to be given to help kids do well. And so I want to be about that. And then, of course, decision makers, whether that's in a school environment or a church environment, as you've recommended, we want to be a resource to help get this good information out. It's sort of squelched in the media sometimes, and we have a hard time getting the real story out there sometimes. So we need people on the ground to help us do that.
So again, if you'd like to contact Lori, you can go to medinstitute.org. Of course, they have a phone number there, and you can give them a call. And of course, there's some great resources. And if nothing else, Medical Institute for Sexual Health has been around for a long time, and it's going to be around for a long time in the future. And that's because Lori's heading up some of the organization there. So thank you once again for coming into this program, and look forward to the next opportunity.
Thank you, Kerby. It's always a pleasure.
That's all we have for today. I hope that you will appreciate the work that is being done there by the Medical Institute. We have a link for it on our website, and it's a great resource that I think you can put to use anytime you might want to do so. And, of course, you can find all of it at our website, pointofview.net. And you've been listening to Point of View.
Election day has come and gone, so tell me, do people like you need to be more or less vigilant, more or less informed, more or less involved in making an impact? I think the answer is clear. Those who value freedom of conscience and religious liberty need to do more than ever to stand up for what the founders gave us and put America on track for greatness. Yes, we face challenges, but it's in the hard times that the greatest victories are seized and won. I urge you today, right now, to seize this opportunity and join the Point of View Radio Truth Team. Be part of the solution our nation needs. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The election is not the end of anything. It's another beginning. And when you join the Truth Team, you make it possible for millions of people to get the real news they desperately need and the practical marching orders that Kerby and the team at Point of View Radio give each day. Join us now in this critical moment. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and we're going to spend some time this first hour kind of taking a break, and then we're going to get back into it. You are going to certainly see a lot of things that we've already posted on our website. Everything from the Attorney General Bill Barr saying no evidence of widespread voter fraud, but again, the way that has been misinterpreted by the mainstream press. I know that would surprise you, is something we're going to try to clarify. And then what about all the evidence that is surfacing in various hearings in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, in Arizona, that suggests, well, some kind of voter irregularities, we might call those frauds, certainly are being testified to, and the mainstream press has completely ignored that, so that's another thing we will get into. And to maybe illustrate how crazy it's become, you have some people actually say now, because of the Attorney General Bill Barr has said there's no evidence of voter fraud, that indeed President Donald Trump should concede. And one of the other articles I put up there, just to give you a little bit of a flair for the range of ideas, this particular author is looking ahead to Trump's second term and already given advice on what Donald Trump should do when he becomes, again, the president and takes the oath of office January 20th. So we have a lot to cover in the next hour, but I thought we'd push that off to the next hour just to give us sort of a mental break for certainly a couple of reasons. Number one, we need that break. Number two, as we get especially into December, a lot of kids have time off. A lot of us maybe need to slow down, maybe read a book. And I just thought it would be so helpful to actually, once again, identify some very important issues that would be worth your consideration. And so we bring back to the microphone today Dr. Louis Markos. He has his PhD from the University of Michigan. He's a professor of English and scholar in residence at Houston Baptist University. You might remember we had him on about a year ago. We talked about his article that appeared in Christianity Today called Homeschool Elitist, which I thought was quite interesting. He is the author of a number of books, including one we're going to talk about that's coming out shortly, The Myth Made Fact Through Christian Eyes, looking at reading mythology through Christian eyes. And of course, he has written many other books, Achilles to Christ, On the Shoulders of Hobbits, Apologetics in the 21st Century, and much, much more. Dr. Markos, always a delight to have you on the program. If nothing else, you encourage us to go out there and read good books.
Thanks so much, Kerby. It's great to be back on.
Let's, if we can, get into this because, first of all, early on in your book, you talk about a radio talk show host, and I'm glad you're not referring to me, who actually told you that after he became a Christian, he was proud that he never read another fiction book. Now, again, I want to hasten to say that's not me, okay? You're talking about somebody else who remained nameless. But nevertheless, it's a question that Christians oftentimes have, and we've talked about this with other authors that encourage us to read some of the great books of the world, and that is that why, if I'm a Christian, should I read about something that isn't true? And, of course, my quick answer, since I'm not as scholarly as you are, is to say, yeah, but Jesus told a lot of stories that weren't true either. They're called parables. But how do you respond to that? Because I'm sure you've run into that with your students at Houston Baptist.
That is exactly right, Kerby. And that story was such an eye-opener for me because it just, sometimes we get that lightning flash. The Spirit just kind of makes everything clear. And that man who told me, this was a good Christian man, led many people to the Lord. I don't want to make fun of him in any way. But he did not read fiction. And if you asked him, why don't you read fiction? He would have said, because I'm a Christian. But it struck me that the real reason he doesn't read fiction, the reason he doesn't know, is that he's a modernist without realizing it. Now, what do I mean by that, Kerby? A modernist is a post-Enlightenment person. And since the Enlightenment, about 250 years ago, what happened is this thing that critics call the Enlightenment split set in. And the Enlightenment split means it's either fact or fiction, either history or myth, either science or religion, either reason or emotion, either logic or intuition, and there's nothing in between. Kerby, this is not a biblical way of looking at the world. Now, I'm a conservative. I got no problem with reading Genesis very literally. I certainly believe in a literal Adam and Eve. I'm okay with longer days. But look, the Bible has a lot to say about science, and we need to listen. But it's not a scientific textbook. Too often, we try to read the Bible as a modern book, and all we look for is something sort of logical and systematic in the modern sense of the word. And we can't hold the Bible to a system of verification that's only 250 years old. You know, a lot of people that do this run into problems, right? Bart Ehrman grew up in a very, very strong fundamentalist home. He went to college. Somebody showed him a contradiction. Well, okay, there are some contradictions, right? In one of the Gospels, it says both of the thieves were making fun of Jesus. But in Luke, it says one of them said, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." Now, this is no problem when you understand that the Gospels are separate eyewitness accounts, and some people were closer and some people were farther away. This doesn't bother us, but if we as Christians have accepted this secular understanding that the only kind of truth is a kind of narrow mathematical logical truth, then we're going to think there's a contradiction. Now, what does this have to do with your question? The trouble is, by buying into this, we as evangelicals, we've become suspicious of fiction because we forgot that Jesus taught in parables. There wasn't a literal man who had two literal sons, and the younger one said, "Give me my inheritance now, Father," and went off and wasted it in a distant land. That is a story Jesus made up, but it tells a great truth. Now, there are other places in the Bible that are literal and historical, but we have to see both Lewis and Tolkien, and this is the very foundation of my book. They, like G.K. Chesterton before them, like to refer to Christianity as a true myth. Now, what does that mean? For most people, that's an oxymoron. No, a myth is merely a story that helps us to understand the big issues of life. Who am I? Why am I here? What is my origin? What is my destination? Anything that addresses that is a myth. So Adam and Eve are a myth, but I happen to believe they're also true. There was a literal Adam and Eve at a real time and a real place. But the fact that it's true historically does not take away from its mythic meaning and mythic import. And a lot of times there is a great deal of truth in fiction. Think of Dante's Divine Comedy. He didn't literally go to hell, purgatory, and paradise. But in that fiction, he was able to touch on truths that we were not able to do in a rational kind of way. Think about the way we draw closer to God through hymns. I don't want just sermons. I don't want just hymns. I want both. I want the word discerned and taught to me verse by verse.
Yes.
But I also want to experience God through beauty and fiction and wonder and awe. That's a long answer, but this is an important topic, isn't it, Kerby?
It is. Well, we need to take a break, and when we come back, we'll delve into that a little bit more because the book is entitled The Myth Made Fact. But it's interesting because C.S. Lewis had this famous essay called Myth Becomes Fact, or Myth Became Fact, and we'll talk about how that fits together. Also, you have some very interesting comments about virtue, and I want to get those on the table as well. So we have a lot to cover, as you might imagine, with Dr. Louis Markos, and we'll continue our conversation with him right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
James Meigs, writing in the City Journal, talks about what he calls the chump effect. He's not the first to use the phrase. Andrew Ferguson coined the phrase years ago to deal with a different issue, but James Meigs uses it to illustrate how many of us feel like chumps when we follow the rules and see others succeed when they break the rules. You know the feeling that he describes. You're inching forward in the freeway exit lane, and another driver flies past and swerves onto the ramp at the last second. Your child has to complete her college entrance exams within a designated time period, while your neighbor's child gets twice as long because of a suddenly diagnosed learning disability. You pay extra to have your pet travel in the airplane's cargo hold and then sit across from a yipping dog who gets to ride on an owner's lap because it is an emotional support animal. He reminds us that thousands of norms, rules, and traditions make civilized life possible. Some, like paying taxes and not littering, are enshrined in law. Most of us follow the standards of etiquette and certainly follow the law. But here are some important questions. What happens when more and more people break the rules? What happens when political leaders break their own rules? These are no longer hypothetical questions. Governors and mayors have been caught violating their edicts, and most of them merely try to justify their actions. A number of district attorneys have decided not to prosecute people who don't pay transit fares and not prosecute shoplifters who steal less than a few $100s. Those of us who follow the rules will start feeling like chumps, and it's only a matter of time before more and more of us start wondering why we play by the rules. If those guys don't have to play by the rules, why should we? This is a prescription for anarchy and lawlessness. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Dr. Louis Markos, and again, a professor of English and scholar in residence at Houston Baptist University. And I'll be honest, when I was growing up, especially in the grade school, they'd let us go into the library. And most of the time, I would go over to the nonfiction section and pick out books there and check them out. But by the time I got into high school, I took a class in great books, and I began to realize how important that was. But then I began to wonder, okay, how do I decide which of these great books to read? And so I began to follow a man by the name of Mortimer Adler and spend some time looking at some of those great books and those kinds of things. Then later, when I joined Pro Ministries, we published a book by Leland Ryken, who is a professor up there at Wheaton on literature. And since that time, of course, we've had him on. Of course, we today have Louis Markos on. And that, I think, gets us back to this idea that sometimes there's a resistance by Christians to say, I'm just going to read nonfiction books. There's nothing I can learn from fiction books. And that's not helpful because, like you said, it's playing into this modernist, atheist, kind of humanistic idea. And the Christian world is both left hemisphere and right hemisphere. It's both imagination and it's logical and linear, isn't it?
Exactly. And that's why C.S. Lewis continues to be the greatest apologist of the 20th century. He brought the two together as they need to be brought together. Lewis, it wasn't just reason that brought Lewis to faith. It was also a use of his imagination. I'm sure most of your listeners know that C.S. Lewis was famously an atheist before he became a Christian.
Yes.
But a lot of people think that he went directly from atheism to Christianity. But that's not his story. That's the story of Lee Strobel, of Josh McDowell, of Chuck Colson. But Louis first became a theist, a believer in God. It took him about a year and a half to move to Christianity. Well, a lot of the reasonable or rational arguments brought him to God, but it took an imaginative leap to get him to believe that Jesus was the Son of God. And it's all got to do with the title of my book, The Myth Made Fact. Lewis was a huge fan of a book called The Golden Bough by Sir James Frazer. He was the Joseph Campbell of his day, a sort of cultural anthropologist and mythologist who studied the tribal, rituals of people across the globe and looked for connections, what we call archetypes, repeating themes or repeating characters like Obi-Wan Kenobi, the wise old man, right? Well, this guy, Sir James Frazer, identified something he called the Corn King. As he looked throughout ancient tribal things, right, he saw this strange story of a god or son of God come to earth who dies and rises again as part of the seasonal cycle, right? We call him Osiris or Adonis or Tammuz or Balder or Mithras, right? Now, Lewis found this a stumbling block, Kerby, because he thought, well, obviously, Jesus is just another myth. He's the Hebrew version of this Corn King archetype. And if you go online right now to atheist websites, you'll find one of their strongest arguments against Christianity is to say that Jesus is just another version of Mithras or Adonis.
Yeah, they just borrow the myth. Yeah.
Yeah, guess what? Lewis found out because he had a long talk with his friend J.R.R. Tolkien, author of The Lord of the Rings, a strong believing Catholic, and he challenged him to look at the data again and come up with a different interpretation. He said, Jack, that was Lewis's nickname, Jack, did you ever wonder, maybe the reason that Jesus sounds like a myth is because he's the myth that became fact or the myth that became true. Now, Kerby, this sort of makes sense, right? It tells us in the Bible that we were all created in the image of God, not just the Jews, but Jews and Gentiles alike, all created in the image of God. And Acts 17, Paul at the Areopagus tells us that all of us grope and reach and yearn after him. And that yearning in the pagan world often manifests itself in this strange mythic archetype of the Corn King. Now, it's only what we call general revelation. It's just a candle in the dark. Most of those stories are very bloody and violent. But there is a seed in there that reveals that yearning that is in the heart of all of us. God has written eternally on the hearts of men. And doesn't it make sense that when God, the Creator God, effects our salvation, he'll do it in a way that not only fulfills the Old Testament law and prophets, but also fulfills the highest yearnings of the pagans. Because Jesus is not just the Messiah of the Jews, he is the Savior of the world. He is the Corn King made true. And when that hit Lewis, within a week, he had accepted Christ, and it revolutionized everything. It comes in both his nonfiction and his fiction. And suddenly he realizes that there are pointers to Christ everywhere. Only in the Bible do we have special revelation, the direct word of God through the prophets, through Moses, through the law. But in these stories and these myths, we find, I like to call it a candle in the darkness. It's only a candle. The Bible's the sun. But that candle, if we follow it, can lead us to the fuller revelation.
The book is entitled Myth Made Fact, and of course it is based upon, in some parts, what we just talked about in terms of C.S. Lewis. But just before we take a break, we've got a couple of minutes here, so I wanted you to expand on that. You have in your introduction a comment about perhaps the greatest work of Christian art ever in the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And last time I was in Rome, I had a chance to go and stare up at that, and it was disappointing because you only got to spend a few minutes there. And sometimes you wanted to talk to a friend, and they were all going, shh, be quiet. But nevertheless, what you have there is not only the depiction of biblical characters, but you also had Michelangelo in a couple of scenes also have some of these, if you will, myths. And in some respects, people say, well, that's just part of humanism. But no, it was an understanding of kind of what you're talking about in the book, isn't it?
It was indeed. And we got to remember that the spine of the Sistine Chapel, the huge frescoes in the center, are from the Bible, but they're only from creation, fall, and the flood. Why? Because that's before Abraham, right? That's sort of the common heritage of the whole human race before God narrowed down to Abraham and the Jewish people. So we've got, again, the sort of general revelation to all people, and then around those frescoes are all the great prophets of the Old Testament that foretold the Messiah: Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Daniel. But interspersed in between the giant frescoes of Isaiah and company are the Greek oracles and the Roman sibyls. What are these pagan priestesses doing? The famous Oracle of Delphi, or the Cumean Sibyl, who leads Dante through the underworld, carrying the golden bow, by the way, in Aeneid, Book 6. What are they doing there? Well, Michelangelo is trying to say that Christ fulfilled what we might call the desire of the ages. Even the oracles and prophets looked forward to Jesus without knowing it. But again, I don't know if this ever bothered you, Kerby, but I used to think, wait a minute, are you telling me that before Jesus came, God ignored completely 99% of the human race and only focused on the Jews? Well, only to the Jews did he give special direct revelation. But he did speak through our reason, through creation, through our conscience, and through our imagination, what Lewis called the good dreams of the pagans.
And you even talk about, and this one surprised me when I was reading your book, that in some respects, let's take Plato. I had to read Plato's Republic, and most young people had to. That was sort of proto-Christ or proto-gospel. Explain that if you might.
It really is. Well, first of all, okay, he's got the famous allegory of the cave, right, where all of us grow up deep in a cave, chained, facing the back wall of the cave. Behind us is a roaring fire. Between our back and the fire are puppeteers, and the fire casts the shadow of the puppets. And we grow up thinking that's reality. What we think is reality is the shadow of a shadow, because the puppets are shadows of what's outside the cave, and we think that's reality. But then what if a man, a philosopher, broke away and turned around and slowly realized his true condition, and he went up and saw the sun? Well, he probably wants to stay up there, but he realizes, I've got to go down and set free these people who are chained in ignorance and darkness. And so he goes back into the cave. But what will happen? He says what will happen to him is that they will turn against him and refuse to listen to him and put him to death. Now, of course, Plato has very much in mind his teacher, Socrates, who was put to death. But it also reads as a sort of proto-Christian prophecy of Christ, who will come into our world of shadows, if you will, and bring the true light that enlightens every man. Wow.
We've got a lot more to cover, but unfortunately we have to take a break. By the way, if you want to ask a question, make a comment, you're welcome to do so. I think you will probably want to just kind of sit back and learn more about myth made fact. But there's also another great piece in one of the forwards to your book, and that's on this issue of virtue. And you've kind of changed my mind about that. We've always thought that virtue has been taken away from the schools, and I think you've changed your mind, and I have as well. So I want to talk about that. And, of course, give an overview to the book, but we just need to take one of those breaks. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Dr. Louis Markos right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today as we talk with Dr. Louis Markos about his book, which is Myth Made Fact. We'll talk more about the book in just a minute. But if you find yourself saying, I'd like to contact him, maybe you'd like to have him come and speak to a homeschool convention. Maybe you'd like to have him come because you have a Christian school, especially a classical Christian school, and would like to have him do a convocation or something like that. I think eventually all of us are going to get out of this lockdown, and he's going to be available for some of the speaking, and certainly you can interact with him. So you can go to our website, click on the button that says see more, and if you look at his picture, we have a link to his Twitter feed and his Facebook page. Of course, if you want to find him at hbu.edu, that's again Houston Baptist University. Just go to hbu.edu, and of course Louis Markos, and you can find him pretty simply there. So those are some opportunities for you to learn more, and especially as we talk about this book, The Myth Made Fact, as it comes out, you're going to want to know about that, or many of his other books. And I certainly would commend to you On the Shoulder of Hobbits. If you've got a young person that's really interested in this, or Tolkien, that would be certainly the case. Apologetics to the 21st Century, of course, it has all sorts of worldview guides for a variety of things, the Iliad, the Odyssey, and many others. So those are all resources, and you can find some of that, of course, linked it on our website at pointofview.net. But Dr. Markos, you changed my mind, because you said, I used to believe that the main problem with education in America was that the public schools, the colleges, universities surgically removed all traces of virtue from the curriculum. And that's kind of what I thought. We don't teach integrity, don't teach virtue anymore. And you said, instead, I believe that that is not the case. If they just removed everything, people would have been clamoring for it. But what you suggest is that these virtues from the scriptures and even from Western culture have been replaced by new virtues. True?
I think this is true. You know, as a quick segue, I've come to believe what inspiration really means, especially for a Christian, is our job is to use our intelligence. If God sends us to college, we need to read, we need to study. But inspiration means when the Holy Spirit rarely puts something out of nowhere in our mind. The Holy Spirit makes that connection that we would never make, and suddenly we have that aha moment. And that aha moment came when I realized, no, they're not throwing out virtue, because then we would notice the emptiness and look for it. Instead, they've replaced it with what I call pseudo-virtues, or what they call pseudo-values. It's kind of junk food that makes you feel full but has no nutritional value. And what I've come to believe in the public schools, and especially in the colleges and universities, there's only 5 values they teach. And that would be inclusivism, egalitarianism, multiculturalism, environmentalism, and I've forgotten what the other one is right now. The tolerance, of course, tolerance. I really think that, and see, what's bad about this, Kerby, is that this may sound like an exaggeration, but it's not. We're raising a generation of young people who say, well, yeah, I sleep around, but it's okay because I recycle cans. And this has gotten so dangerous, okay? I don't want to get political here, but people need to understand there is a big difference between the statement that Black Lives Matter and the group Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, I think most of our listeners know that. We've certainly covered that.
Just read their webpage, okay? This is Marxist identity politics. So why am I saying this? Because I'm even seeing some of my own students that we've trained up in the Bible, that we've trained up putting Black Lives Matter circles on their Facebook page. They don't understand that this represents the very opposite of what Christianity teaches. There's no belief that we're made in the image of God but fallen. And what's happening is that, okay, you need to understand that what's happening to us as evangelicals, the way we're being fooled by this stuff, is exactly what happened to the Catholics 30 or 40 years ago, who were fooled by something called liberation theology. Liberation theology was Marxist with a small veneer of Catholicism. What we're seeing today is the same thing, but it's attacking evangelical church, not just the mainline Protestants, but real evangelicals, Kerby's, who are being suckered in because it's playing on their desire. And of course we believe in justice and social justice, but we need to train our mind. And I know it sounds crazy, But I believe our mind is trained not just by nonfiction, but by fiction, by wrestling with these stories, by understanding the myths, by understanding who am I, why am I here, what is my purpose, by looking at the nature of God and of man and of the universe. And sometimes it's the fiction and the myths and even the pagan myths that do this the best. They help us to understand the real nature of the story that we're part of. And the story that we're part of is not a simplistic, reductive view of everybody's either a victimizer or a victim, an oppressor or an oppressed. It's a much bigger story. It's a meta-narrative of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. It's all there in the mythology. But we don't know the story. We don't know what story we're part of. And so we've allowed the media to rewrite the narrative, and we are just giving away right into it. I mean, some evangelicals who should know better have just given into this new narrative. And Kerby, I believe, okay, I think it's football where they say the best defense is a strong offense. We have got to stop always being defensive and say, that's wrong, that's wrong. We've got to tell them what's right. We've got to make the real virtues so compelling, so good and true and beautiful that the students won't be fooled by all the imitations. That's how you do it. My kids never fell to bad music, whether it's rap or heavy metal, all that stuff, not because I shut off the heavy metal. It's because I raised them on good music. So they understood, and the good music doesn't just mean classical. They got to hear good jazz, even good Disney songs, all sorts of hymns, of course, all of that stuff, so they can become discerning and immediately see through the counterfeit. But that's not happening anymore. We have bought into the counterfeit and allowed them to tell us Christians what the story is. This is really important stuff, Kerby. It's a battle that's going on.
It is. Dr. Markos, it is interesting that you brought up the idea of discernment, because one of the things I keep saying on this program is we really need to develop discernment. And certainly, when I used to read that Jesus said there'll be a time when even the elect will be deceived, in Matthew 24, I thought, probably not. And now I'm seeing the deception that's sometimes taking place, as you said, within the church. And so back to your point, certainly part of our defense is to always be prepared to make a defense and always be prepared to give an answer, which you see in 1 Peter 3:15. But you're also talking about offense, and that is tearing down strongholds and lofty thoughts raised up against the knowledge of God and taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. We really need, perhaps more than ever, to teach discernment to our children and our grandchildren, to your students at HBU, because as you're seeing, it is so easy for people to actually be conformed to this culture rather than transformed by the renewing of their minds in Christ Jesus.
They are, and they're not. Now, I will tell you one good piece of news, okay, because we're both lovers of classical Christian education. You might even done a segment on this. About a year ago, a secular group did a long review where they interviewed graduates of regular Christian schools, classical Christian schools, secular schools, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what they found was amazing. And let me just give you one statistic. They found that students who graduated from classical Christian schools, not just run-of-the-mill Baptist schools, classical Christian schools were more likely to be opposed to gay marriage, and understand why. But at the same time, Kerby, they were more likely to have an actual gay friend. This is why we're going to change the world. We're going to be salt and light, and we are going to be against these things because we're for the person. We're going to be against gay marriage, not because we're disgusted by it, but because we understand it's a self-destructive lifestyle that is hurting people that we love. When we have that story to tell, a story that's really about setting us free and allowing us to truly understand who we are, that God created us to be, that's when we're going to be the salt and light. But we haven't done that. We need to come out and show, again, that we've got the best story, that we've got the best understanding of who we are and what our purpose is. And people are hungry for purpose. And Kerby, they're hungry for heroes. That's why Hollywood is only hanging on a string because of Marvel superhero movies.
That's right. Yeah.
I mean, those are the new mythic heroes of today. It's the new Hercules and Theseus and Perseus of today.
That is.
And people are hungry.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll come a little bit further back to the book, which is, again, The Myth Made Fact, Reading Greek and Roman Mythology Through Christian Eyes, and Dr. Louis Markos is the author. And I'll just give you a brief overview when we come back from the break, but there's a section on journeys and origins, a section on Platonic myths, a section on 4 great heroes. We've sort of alluded to that already. The tragic house of Thebes, the tragic house of Aretus, and as well Love Lost and Found. And so we'll look at some of those sections. And again, 50 different chapters, some great appendices, and most importantly, a section on how to pronounce any of those words, which I may have mispronounced as we went through those. So those are all great resources that are available in this book that'll be coming out. But if you find yourself saying, I'd like to know a little bit more about Dr. Louis Markos, of course, we have links to his Facebook page, his Twitter feed, and you can find those. And then in just a few minutes after that, we're going to get back into the issues in the news. All that coming up right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few more minutes, and again, we are privileged to have with us Dr. Louis Markos, and the book is entitled Myth Made Fact. Not out quite yet. I've had a chance to look at an advanced copy by PDF, but let's, if we can, talk about what is in that book, and then for just a few minutes, I might also talk about some of your previous books, but this is a way in which you take people on a journey. You let them look at some of the myths. You can see how some of those are very relevant to our day, but again, 50 different different chapters, and it's certainly something individuals can read on their own. But I also think the way you've written this, it could be something that could be used in a small group, certainly used in a Christian school or homeschool. So, Dr. Louis Markos, how can people use your book?
I really wanted this to be a sort of one-size-fits-all book. So it is a book you can read on your own as a book, especially if you want to read it devotionally. Read, 1 or 2 chapters in the night or in the morning. It's full of reflection questions. I mean, really deep reflection questions, not yes/no questions. It's also got lots and lots of scripture that you can meditate on. But it can also be used as a textbook. Classical Christian teacher, homeschooling mom. It can be used as a Bible study where everybody gets together, reads a chapter, talks about the myth, and really, really digs into these questions, what they tell us about ourselves. And I got to say, Kerby, of all the books I published, this is number 20. This is the most beautiful. I mean, the Classical Academics Press pulled out all the stops. It's got color photographs in it.
Do.
It's beautifully laid out with, the color notes and things like that. It's just a nice feeling book. And you even said, I insisted, and they really loved the idea. I got pronunciation guides in there because so many kids, like my own daughter, who's a big reader, these little girls, they grow up and they read everything, but they can't pronounce anything. I remember my daughter saying something like, who the heck is that? I've never heard of that mythological character, but of course the kids never hear these pronounced. Right. They only read them. So I wanted that in there, all sorts of indexes and stuff like that, and books to read, even movies to watch. Everything's in there, and I'm really glad that, again, they just did as much as they could to make this a sort of universal book that can be used by all ages and, just a book club thing where you can get together and talk about it. I just want to get people back into these myths and feel that they're relevant to us today so we can wrestle with them all over again.
Again, I love the pronunciation guide because not only that, I was thinking as I was going through your pronunciation guide, I think even my high school teacher that was teaching some of the Greek myths was mispronouncing some of the words too. So that's probably is one of the reasons why we don't always pronounce them. But let me give you a little bit of a look for the structure because you do, in a sense, give kind of a short devotional on whatever that particular myth is. Then you have a section called Reflections, sometimes a couple of notes. And then, as you said, there's a whole question of applications, and sometimes those go on for maybe 9 questions with sub-questions underneath and links to Scripture. So this would be quite a very significant teaching alone. But then it is amazing because I know how expensive these plates are. You've got a number of these classic diagrams, pictures, paintings, and others that all illustrate some of the points as well. So it is almost like a coffee table book in terms of the amount of time and effort they put into it. Go ahead.
And we want that. I mean, the good, the true, and the beautiful go together. This is something as evangelicals, too often we made, ugly churches that look like office buildings. And we need to realize that those 3 things are related. Heck, Plato understood this, but so did the fathers of the church, that they go together. And, we've let beauty die or become totally relativized in our culture. And once beauty dies, goodness will die, and then truth will die. That's just the way it works. They go together. And we've given up the struggle. I mean, just a good example of that is that you'll still have evangelicals who will fight for the truth, but then they'll tell you, oh, beauty is just completely relative and in the eye of the beholder, right? We don't realize that, there are standards, right? God is the standard of truth, but also of goodness and beauty. And I think stories help to combine those things together.
Let's again also mention that this book is coming out, so people can be looking for it. The Myth Made Fact, Reading Greek and Roman Mythology Through Christian Eyes. But many of the other books that you've written, in particular, I might point people to On the Shoulders of Hobbits, as well as Apologetics for the 21st Century. And a couple of those books are resources that are available as well. And so if they wanted to find those books, again, you're really trying to equip this generation, young people in particular that you're teaching, but us oldsters can learn some things as well about what we can learn from some of this great literature and how we can even use it in terms of evangelism and apologetics. True?
It is so important. And I think if we're going to win this generation, We have got to. I teach at Houston Baptist University, and we have an online master's in cultural apologetics. My son will be graduating with that degree in a week and a half. And what cultural apologetics means is that, of course, we teach the scientific, the logical, the historical, all that, intelligent design. We teach all that, but we also teach imaginative apologetics, looking at story and myth and film as well, because that's where the story's won. Again, we need to tell a better story. This is a visual age, and it needs to be engaged. And you're right. All the books I write in some way are about equipping people. In fact, I've got a book I published with Harvest House called Atheism on Trial. And what I showed in that book, Kerby, is that all the arguments the new atheists have been making, they make them as if they're based on new research. Everything the new atheists are saying have been said for 2,600 years. And so that book is more, so I go back and show you the pre-Socratics, the Stoics, the Epicureans, the Gnostics. They've been making these arguments for over 2,000 years, and they've been answered, and sometimes answered by pagans like Plato and Aristotle. But we don't study the past, and so we don't know that. We were fooled by the Da Vinci Code, forgetting that Gnosticism was decisively done away with 1,700 years ago. Or even better, this guy named Marcion, who taught that the Old and New Testament were different gods. Well, no, Tertullian and Justin Martyr dealt with that guy 1,800 years ago. But we don't read the old books, and so we make the same mistakes over and over again. You mentioned earlier, Kerby, about how even the elect will be fooled. Make sure your listeners read The Last Battle. That's the last of the Chronicles of Narnia, and see how the good Narnians are fooled because they take out of context the phrase, Aslan is not a tame lion. Well, that's absolutely true, but this fake Aslan in this book is doing arbitrary things. Now, today, our students are not fooled by Aslan is not a tame lion. We're fooled by the complete opposite of that. Jesus is a God of love and tolerance and inclusivism. We've gone to the other extreme and think everything is okay and that Jesus would be in favor of just doing whatever you want. So we've gone to the other extreme. We don't understand the fullness of God's revelation. And sometimes the myths show us God's, both his mercy and his wrath, and the two have to be held together, or we're not worshiping the God of the Bible.
Very good. Well, again, if you want more information, of course, we have a lot of it on our website, pointofview.net. Of course, you can go to hbu.edu. Of course, as you go to our website, we have not only his link to his Facebook page and his Twitter feed, but all sorts of other great information. So thank you for joining us once again here on Point of View.
Thanks so much. It was great to be on, and love to come back again.
Okay, well, we will see if we can do so. When we come back from the break, though, we are going to spend some time looking at the news. You know, today we really going to take on this issue of what did the Attorney General Bill Barr say. Now, he did indeed say there was no evidence of widespread voter fraud, but he also gave some disclaimers that simply just got eliminated by the Associated Press. And so we want to give him his due, but then also talk about the fact that that's caused some people to say, well, it's time for Donald Trump to give up at a time when we are actually finding out more information from some of these hearings that have been held in Arizona, in Michigan, in Pennsylvania, to mention just a few. So we'll get into that. And then, of course, we have all sorts of other stories that we want to try to cover. But most importantly, in this next hour, as we get into those topics, perhaps you have some comments, questions, and we would certainly welcome your phone calls. That number is 1-800-351-1212. So we'll get back into the news right after these messages.
Election day has come and gone, so tell me, do people like you need to be more or less vigilant, more or less informed, more or less involved in making an impact? I think the answer is clear. Those who value freedom of conscience and religious liberty need to do more than ever to stand up for what the founders gave us and put America on track for greatness. Yes, we face challenges, but it's in the hard times that the greatest victories are seized and won. I urge you today, right now, to seize this opportunity and join the Point of View Radio Truth Team. Be part of the solution our nation needs. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The election is not the end of anything. It's another beginning. And when you join the Truth Team, you make it possible for millions of people to get the real news they desperately need and the practical marching orders that Kerby and the team at Point of View Radio give each day. Join us now in this critical moment. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to get back into some of the issues in the news, and let me open up the phones to give you a chance to join the conversation. That number is 1-800-351-1212. Yesterday, I probably could have talked about it, but I wanted to get all the context for the statement made by the Attorney General, Bill Barr. Now, you around this table have heard, especially Kelly Shackelford, say very positive things about him. And in some respects, I was fearful that as soon as he came out with his statement, there would be people calling for him to be fired, or he's part of the deep state and all that kind of stuff. But fortunately, the worst has actually come from the other side, and that has to be with the Associated Press, because it is kind of intriguing to see how it was covered. If you go back, let me tell you what he said to the Associated Press, and then look at how it was covered. And if nothing else, this once again helps you to say, maybe I should have some discernment when I see a news story. Because in the interview, if I can quote this, it has quotes, so I assume this is the exact statements he said. The Attorney General, Bill Barr, said there's been one assertion that could be systemic fraud, and that would be the claim that machines were programmed essentially to skew the election results. And the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice have looked into that, and so far we haven't seen anything to substantiate that. Now, did you hear a word there, or phrase? So far, okay. In just a few minutes, we're going to get into that a little bit more, because he also talks about the fact that when you're looking at these areas, a lot of the claims of fraud, now I'm quoting from him, are very particularized to a particular set of circumstances or actors or conduct. They're not systemic allegations, and those have been run down, and they're being run down. So the point he's making is, no, we don't find any worldwide, nationwide, other nation systemic actions. Okay, that's probably true. I don't necessarily have any reason to disagree with that. That's not exactly how it got covered in the Associated Press. Let me read from the AP comment. Disputing President Donald Trump's persistent, baseless claims. Oh, there we go. See, it's almost like the absence of evidence. Again, Donald Trump's persistent and baseless claims, Attorney General William Barr declared Tuesday the U.S. Department of Justice had uncovered no evidence of widespread voter fraud that could change the outcome of the 2020 election. Probably true as far as it goes. And then goes into some other things. Today, we've not seen fraud on a scale that could have affected a different outcome in the election. So he's just being honest with those facts. But persistent and baseless claims, and we'll come to that in just a minute. But nevertheless, even after the Attorney General did speak out, what doesn't sometimes get covered by the press, which is why we try to cover it here, is what came from the Trump legal team. These are the individuals that have filed some of their lawsuits. Now, the argument up until now has been, look, you've lost every one of the lawsuits. Well, first of all, a lot of those lawsuits were filed by individuals, not by the Trump legal team. So that, first of all, anybody can file a lawsuit and anybody can lose a lawsuit. So that's not necessarily proof of anything other than they were poorly conceived in the first place. That being said, if you looked at some of the Trump legal team, they filed some that don't make any sense to me either, but that's okay. They did it, and it's done. But now the legal team said, quote, with all due respect to the Attorney General, there hasn't been any semblance of a Department of Justice investigation. We have gathered ample evidence of illegal voting in at least 6 states, which they have not examined. We have many witnesses swearing under oath that they saw crimes being committed in connection with voter fraud. As far as we know, not a single one has been interviewed by the Department of Justice. The Justice Department also hasn't audited any voting machines or used their subpoena powers to determine the truth. Okay, so I think that's probably the case. But let's at least give credit where credit is due. The Attorney General, if you might remember, did something that many people on the left thought was very controversial, because he did, about a week after the election, authorized federal prosecutors to pursue what he called substantial allegations of voter irregularities. And if there are clear and apparently credible allegations of irregularities that, if true, could potentially impact the outcome of a federal election in an individual state, then they would pursue that as they go along. The point that I think is key is, first of all, that would affect the election. The biggest problem I've had from the very beginning about voter fraud is that when you identify it, there's always kind of a, yeah, but it wouldn't have made any difference in that election. And we were off air using an example of maybe a baseball, since we all love baseball around here, maybe the opposing team is ahead by 10 runs and the batter up there hits a grand slam. So now it's 10-4. Still not going to win the game. But then the umpire goes back and says, there was a fan that interfered with the ball, or it didn't hit the foul pole just right, and so they take it back. You're going, whoa, wait a minute. That he deserves the 4 runs, even if you ruled it incorrectly. You still want to do the right thing. Do you see what I'm saying? And the problem is that so often our elections have been so one-sided that there isn't a lot of motivation to prosecute voter fraud. And there have been a few attorney generals. I live right now in the state of Texas, and the attorney general of the state of Texas said, no, we're going to prosecute these individuals because, if nothing else, to demonstrate that this constant refrain that you hear saying there's no voter fraud is not true. Because even if it doesn't affect this election, and again, as I said, the examples we are seeing of voter fraud may not be enough to overturn basically 5-figure difference between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, but they may. It's worth pursuing, and I think that this is actually something that should have happened a long time ago. Nevertheless, I was watching a news broadcast the other night where this one woman, and I won't say her name, just went and said there's absolutely no evidence of fraud. Every one of these lawsuits has been rejected. The Attorney General hasn't found anything. Of course, if she'd want to make her list, she could have talked about 2 or 3 other people that have said that as well. But nevertheless, that doesn't mean we shouldn't investigate some of the fraudulent things taking place. Because even if they don't affect the presidential election, and we still don't know that for sure, they might, they certainly could affect who's elected to Congress, who's elected to the state legislature. And I'll come into that in just a minute, because it's amazing how many ballots showed up in one particular jurisdiction where only they voted for Biden and didn't even vote down the ballot. Those look a little suspect, but we'll talk about that in just a minute. But before we take a break, let's be fair and say that one of the reasons that this Attorney General statement is so striking is the second article I've posted, and that simply says that Trump should now concede because, after all, the Attorney General and others have made it very clear that there's not enough evidence of vote fraud to change the presidential election. And so it's time to fold your tent and simply go home. So that is the other article I've posted so that you could see that. And I think, to be fair, the writer here says this does not mean there's no merit or some claims of fraud or major human error. It means only that the evidence of criminal wrongdoing, if any, is too slender to put Trump over the top. The Justice Department may prosecute particular instances of fraud, if any, later, but Trump's only recourse of staying in office will remain in the civil courts. So I wanted you to see both sides. We come back, though, we are seeing growing amounts of voter irregularities. Let's call them those right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
James Meigs, writing in the City Journal, talks about what he calls the chump effect. He's not the first to use the phrase. Andrew Ferguson coined the phrase years ago to deal with a different issue, but James Meigs uses it to illustrate how many of us feel like chumps when we follow the rules and see others succeed when they break the rules. You know the feeling that he describes. You're inching forward in the freeway exit lane, and another driver flies past and swerves onto the ramp at the last second. Your child has to complete her college entrance exams within a designated time period, while your neighbor's child gets twice as long because of a suddenly diagnosed learning disability. You pay extra to have your pet travel in the airplane's cargo hold and then sit across from a yipping dog who gets to ride on an owner's lap because it is an emotional support animal. He reminds us that thousands of norms, rules, and traditions make civilized life possible. Some, like paying taxes and not littering, are enshrined in law. Most of us follow the standards of etiquette and certainly follow the law. But here are some important questions. What happens when more and more people break the rules? What happens when political leaders break their own rules? These are no longer hypothetical questions. Governors and mayors have been caught violating their edicts, and most of them merely try to justify their actions. A number of district attorneys have decided not to prosecute people who don't pay transit fares and not prosecute shoplifters who steal less than a few $100s. Those of us who follow the rules will start feeling like chumps, and it's only a matter of time before more and more of us start wondering why we play by the rules. If those guys don't have to play by the rules, why should we? This is a prescription for anarchy and lawlessness. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And once again, of course, a lot of people are saying it is time for the president to step down to concede the election. And, of course, that investigation continues on whether he does or not. And what is so intriguing is that in many of these different locales, you are starting to have some of these public hearings where some of this information is starting to make its way out. Will that be enough to overturn the election? Well, in just a minute, I will talk about an article that I posted looking ahead to Trump's second term, where some people are absolutely convinced this is going to happen. I don't see it, but that's okay. That is at least a possibility. But it all comes down to, even if you can show that fraud could take place, even if you could show that fraud did take place, how do you overturn an election? It's going to be difficult because, as we said weeks ago, because you realize it's almost been a month since the election, as we pointed out weeks ago, that just put yourself in the position of a judge. Let's make it real easy. Let's assume it's a judge that is convinced that there has been some kind of voting irregularity. We won't even call it fraud. Maybe somebody didn't follow the right rules. Maybe they didn't count things right. Maybe they did it with an intent to be fair. Maybe they did it with an intent to be fraudulent. We won't care. But you're convinced that something is wrong. Then this evidence is presented to you. You have to think about what it would take for a judge, or in the case of the Supreme Court, a justice, to say all of those votes we're going to ignore because we don't know which ones are accurate, which ones are fraudulent, then what do? I mean, you start thinking through the implications. People said, oh, well, we could have another election. No, that's not going to happen. So what do? I think you recognize that we are surfacing very good examples of what look fraudulent, but at the same time, we can't prove it. Because as I shared on this air the other day, I'm starting to find some individuals in certain election venues that are acknowledging, yeah, we probably shouldn't have counted those absentee ballots that came in late. Those signatures don't match. But once you separate the envelope from the ballot, you don't know how they voted. So you don't have a way to go back. To use a very trite phrase, the horse is out of the barn. So how do you do that? We have an instance now in a couple of places, well documented, of dead people that have voted. Zombie voters. Okay, that has happened in every election. How do we, first of all, find what those individuals did, who voted in their place, and then can we change? I mean, just start thinking through how difficult it would be. But at the same time, just because we can't prove it in a court doesn't mean it doesn't happen, because let's, if we can now go from state to state. For those of you in Arizona, we'll start there. You've probably heard some of this, but again, most of our listeners don't live in Arizona. Then I'm going to take you to Pennsylvania. Some of you in the Keystone State have heard this, but people in the other states haven't heard this. And then we'll go to Michigan. And again, people outside of Michigan haven't perhaps heard this. And it's quite possible, because the press has done such a crummy job of covering this, this might be news for you for the first time. So let's look first of all at the Arizona hearing. Had an individual there, a witness, says that the signatures on the ballots did not even resemble in any way what they were matching to, and many of them were completely illegible, and so we were told, the witness says, to completely ignore them. Another witness says that we thought that we were done counting ballots, and then all of a sudden more truckloads of ballots were coming in, and I'm like, how can you know how many ballots are still out there? And so that was the case. Well, then we've had some of the testimony, which has to do with Dominion Software. And again, to be fair, I posted yesterday a piece where Dominion Software was saying, well, all these things being said are not true. But then you have to say, well, wait a minute. This comes from a couple of individuals that kind of sort of know about this, that have actually done some of the investigation, a cyber security expert. And I'll go into that in just a minute, Phil Waldron. And Colonel Phil Waldron, by the way, a retired Army colonel, who said that Dominion's Suite user manual is about 1.5 inches thick. My team went through the user manual and looked at the instances where in the user's manual it tells operators to connect the Ethernet cords to the router, and the systems are connected to the internet, something that people deny. He also says our teams looked at the spirographs on the Dominion network on Election Day and showed the increased web traffic, internet traffic on Election Day. And it is very clear that you can basically say that they were connected to the internet, and yet there's no transparency of how the voter information is processed, moved, or stored. Again, that shows the possibility that it could exist, but much more. Then you have one that was announced just the other day in Virginia. This is the Olmsted Project, and we might get somebody on later once some of this information comes out, in which there were a number of claims, one from 3 whistleblowers that provide personal eyewitness accounts demonstrating potential election fraud, some of which affected thousands of ballots. Perhaps the most shocking was the truck driver. This is a postal truck driver in Pennsylvania that estimated that at least 144,000 and perhaps 288,000, depends on how these boxes are stacked, were actually completed ballots taken across 3 state lines in October, with the implication perhaps that then these would be filled out in advance for Joe Biden in case there was a situation in which Donald Trump was outperforming expectations. So let's, if we can, go to a couple of other cases. Let me do Michigan, since that one happens to be on my stack at the moment. This is where an IT worker trained and contracted by the Dominion voting system and worked at the tabulating center in Detroit claimed yesterday that she saw election workers illegally rescanning batches of ballots for Joe Biden over and over again to create more votes. The individual, Melissa Carone, spoke to the Michigan State Oversight Committee at a hearing in Lansing, Michigan, and said that the center was a place where she was there for a total of 27 hours, beginning on the morning of Election Day. She said, quote, "What I witnessed at the TCF Center was simply fraud the whole 27 hours I was there." She went on to say, quote, "There were batches of ballots being run through the tabulating machines numerous times, being counted 8 to 10 times, and she said, I watched these with my own eyes." She said the election official in charge of counting the mail-in ballots, in some respects, were actually there. She also said, interesting enough, as we looked at these mail-in ballots, she said, quote, "There was not a single ballot the whole night, the whole 27 hours I was there, that was for Donald Trump. Not a single ballot." And so, again, that was something that was taking place for maybe some of you in Michigan. While I'll stay in Michigan for another minute, let's talk about that, because there was another testimony in which they said all the military ballots she saw were looking like Xerox copies of each other. None of the individuals were Michigan voters, and all of them were for Joe Biden. And here you start seeing some things that don't make a great deal of sense, because she said, quote, "I witnessed the military ballots being duplicated. I thought it was strange that only Biden's name was selected and there was no down ballot." You would think that some in the military might vote at least for, Joe Biden, and then for your U.S. senator. And you didn't even see that, or all the way down to, all the other races that were taking place there in Michigan. And so, again, these were some individuals that were speaking at the State Senate's Oversight Committee in the office building there in Lansing, Michigan, because she pointed out there was not a single Trump vote in any of the so-called military ballots, and none of the voters were ones that they could verify were registered. So I need to take a break, but when I come back, we want to go to Pennsylvania, and that is a hearing that was actually held in the Wyndham Hotel in Gettysburg. And one of the individuals that brought that to fruition is a Senator Doug Mastriano, who, interestingly enough, I found in another article, which I'll talk about, after he actually pulled together this particular study and this particular hearing, then Twitter actually suspended his account. He's not the only one. Another individual as well, by the name of Bobby Peaton, and we'll talk about him in just a minute, a mathematician, also found that his account was suspended. And so you're starting to have some other things that are surfacing in some of these investigations. Does that prove fraud? No. Is it certainly something that needs to be addressed in the future? Absolutely. And it really prevents, I think, individuals from making these outlandish statements saying that because you haven't won any of these cases in front of a judge, that means there was no fraud. I think we have lots of anecdotal evidence already that there was. Let's take a break. We'll talk more about that right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
On the last hour, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's ask you parents out there kind of a hypothetical for just a minute. You know, you hear some noises from your kid's bedroom and maybe even smell something, and you come to the door and it's locked, and you're going, Okay, let me in. And it's maybe 5 or 10 minutes before they finally open the door. And do you just assume that everything was fine, or do you assume that maybe something that was a little bit illegal, immoral, inappropriate might have been happening in the room? And I think you know the answer to that. Of course you do. And it isn't because you think your kids are criminals, but, you do believe in human sin nature. And so in some respects, when somebody is not allowing you to see something, you can't necessarily always go to they did something wrong, but you have some good questions. Now, how does that relate to what we're talking about? In two very significant ways. Number one, as you may know, there were a number of times in which the various election workers, poll watchers, were excluded from things that were taking place. And so it doesn't necessarily prove that fraud was taking place, but if you believe in sinful behavior, and I do, and if you believe that this election was one that individuals wanted to actually manipulate, you might at least think that it's possible and even probable. Can you prove that in a court of law? Not if you don't have the evidence, and that's, of course, one of the challenges that people are facing. But what you're getting right now from some people in the mainstream press is there's nothing to see here. It's like the kid that sees you after 5 minutes and lets you in and says, "Oh, there's nothing to see here, Mom. My dad, we're doing everything right." You wouldn't believe that. And that's kind of what's going on here. Number two, it also relates to the fact that when we do see things, they always have an explanation. There is a process known as curing, and that is where sometimes when you try to get a ballot in a machine, the ballot is not read by the machine. And there's a reason for that. It's got a coffee stain on it. It's illegible. It didn't come through. So we do have pictures of individuals filling out ballots. Those are easily found out on the internet. Again, if you assume that those individuals, who in most cases did not have anybody looking over their shoulder, were filling those out appropriately and accurately, great. But it's, again, the same kind of explanation that I just gave you. When you go to your kid's room, the door is locked for a few minutes, you don't get a chance to see what they're doing. Or, let's change it, you have kids that are maybe having to copy something down on some homework assignments, and actually they're copying each other's papers. They're not copying the assignment. As a parent or a teacher, you'd say, wait a minute, I think they might be cheating. Doesn't mean that you can prove it, and doesn't necessarily mean that they were always doing the wrong thing. But these are the kinds of situations we're finding ourselves in, where the press is saying there's nothing to see here. Well, there is something to see here, and it's being described, I think, in such detail as to at least cause people to pay some attention. And the example I want to take you to now is in Pennsylvania. This was a hearing that was convened by Senator Doug Mastriano, who is a senator in Pennsylvania. And probably the piece that most people remember is the one where, again, retired Colonel Phil Waldron, actually a former combat officer and a person that worked in Army information and electronic warfare, began to identify what he called, first of all, these spike anomalies in the voting patterns. Now, you've seen this before. Events where the numerical amount of votes processed in a time period is not feasible or mechanically possible under normal circumstances. That's his quote. Now, in that particular case, he was asked, okay, so what did you see? The best you could see is a total, I think they said, of about 604,000 votes, which were all processed in about 90 minutes. Now, the question that was then asked is, how much of that vote was for Joe Biden? And Waldron said, well, close to about 600,000. Actually, he said, then went back and said, okay, it's probably the figures were probably close to 570 plus thousand. So 570,000. It's always hard to remember numbers on radio. How much for Trump? 3,200. So the difference between 570,000 and 3,000, in case you want to do the math on that, you have this incredible batch, which went 99.4% for Joe Biden. and 0.6% for Donald Trump. Is that possible? Very unlikely. Can we prove fraud? You can certainly get people in Michigan to start wondering whether or not that is the case. Which brings me to another point. There's a phrase that they use here in the state of Texas, and Steve and I were talking about that. You know, you've heard it before. You know, if you throw a rock into a pack of dogs, the one that yelps is the one that got hit. And sometimes you wonder if some of this is hitting a little too close to home, because I just mentioned Senator Doug Mastriano. Senator Mastriano ran into some difficulty because Twitter suspended his account. Now, maybe he said something on his Twitter account they didn't like, but it seems as if they were just simply upset because he had actually held this hearing. There was another person there as well that I thought you might like to know about, and his name is Bobby Piton. You might say, okay, who is he? Well, he's an expert witness who testified at the hearing on Tuesday. And again, he was not appreciated. And again, Twitter suspended his account. I think his is still suspended. And by the way, a matter of fact, he may have been in Arizona, so I may be conflating both Arizona and Pennsylvania. So sorry. For the one in Pennsylvania, eventually Twitter later said that the suspension of Mastriano's account, the senator in Pennsylvania, was an error. Isn't that how convenient that is? But Bobby Piton is the one that said Twitter actually banned his account because of the research that he was doing in that regard. And he said, if nothing else, if I was an executive at a publicly traded company, I would never sign this. I would risk jail time having all my money taken from me in lawsuits. So to answer your question, I would never, ever have certified these results. I believe they're fraudulent based on the data. And my sister asked me a simple question this morning. She says, how sure are you? And I said, I'd be willing to put my life on it. I'm sure that this analysis, and I'm sure of my analysis, and assuming the data I got right from the state and everything else was accurate. So these are some individuals that now, as they start testifying, one in Arizona, another in Pennsylvania, notice something very peculiar. And what happened was their Twitter accounts were suspended, which is why now some people are starting to say, maybe we need to actually have a vote clawback. Okay, that's the word for today. What's a clawback? Well, it's the idea that we need to claw back our electoral college votes. And I'll just read this article. Arizona lawmaker is calling for colleagues to withhold the state's electoral college votes due to allegations of fraud. Recognize this is not a groundswell. It's just one or two individuals, but one of the state senators in Arizona said at a hearing that there's enough evidence of fraud to invalidate the state's vote for the president. And so Mark Fincham, I think is how you pronounce his name, Representative Fincham, said, we are clawing our electoral college votes back. We will not release them. That's what I'm calling our colleagues in both the House and the Senate, that would be the Arizona House and Senate, to do, exercise our authority under the U.S. Constitution. And that gets us back to Constitution 101, because the states and the state legislatures in particular are the ones that have the authority to select the electors to the Electoral College. In the past, that was done without a popular vote, but now most states simply assign the electors based on the outcome of the popular vote in that state, but it is not required to do so. And so that's why you're having some, and I do want to say very few, some saying that that might be the case. And that brings us back not only from Arizona, but now we're back into Pennsylvania, because Doug Mastriano, the senator I just mentioned a minute ago, also has said that he is not so convinced that they should send those electors to Harrisburg, and said all the witnesses should be allowed to come forward. The media should have done this if they cared about truth. The evidence is compelling. So you're starting to see people talking about this idea of clawback. And so that maybe brings us to one of the other articles I've posted by Nicholas Waddy, looking ahead to Trump's second term. Kind of intriguing there, because he is convinced that eventually this will end up in the United States House of Representatives, and then eventually Donald Trump will be reelected. And then he starts setting forth all the people that should be added to the cabinet for Donald Trump's second term. So I think I've given you the wide range of all the views that people are held to. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just give you as a program note that tomorrow we're going to have our friend Dr. Doug Groothuis, and we're going to be talking about philosophy in 7 sentences. And I think you'll appreciate that because we try to, from time to time, mix things up so we're not always talking about these issues in the news. And then we also have Dr. Brent Taylor on with us, and we'll be talking about his book, Presidential Leadership. You might remember him. He's been with us on a number of occasions where we've done our Millennial Roundtable, but certainly has done a great study of the leadership principles of some of these presidents, and that'll kind of get us out of the political realm there as well. And then we're going to have, of course, a couple of great conversations, I suspect, on Friday when it comes down to the weekend edition. But just before we end, I've been talking about electoral and voting irregularities. Some might be fraud, some might be mistakes, but there's another aspect which is not as controversial and very well documented, and that is the fact that we are well aware of the fact that both the social media platforms and the mainstream media, but I'll just focus on the social media platforms for just a minute, were doing what they could to bias all of that was taking place. And on Monday, I have a commentary coming out that I've already sort of mentioned here. Research that was done by Dr. Robert Epstein, who is a Democrat, who actually makes it very clear on more than one occasion that he's not a Trump supporter, but he's a supporter of democracy. And he's been doing some research in this whole area. This is not the first time he did it, by the way, because he actually did some studies in which he concluded that Google may have shifted about 2 million votes to Hillary Clinton in 2016, and then estimated that at the very minimum could have shifted as much as 6 million votes this time to Joe Biden. And now is estimating that once they finish their research, because that was done with a limited amount of research, he's concluding that maybe it could have shifted as much as 15 million votes. Now, we can sit here and say, well, that's not fair. The media is supposed to be fair. Well, they own the companies and they do what they want to do, which is all the more reason for you to exercise some discernment. But if you're not familiar, he has, of course, had field agents, especially in some of the swing states, Arizona, Florida, North Carolina, and others, and has recorded in the research he did there about 500,000 experiences talking about vote reminders and all the rest. And we've talked about this before because he honestly thought that probably the, if you will, the smoking gun in all of that was the fact that in a period of days before the actual vote, on Google's homepage, there was a vote reminder only sent to liberals, and not one of the conservative field agents received a vote reminder. When he went public with that, all of a sudden, Google apparently shut off the manipulation that night, and the next 4 days before the election, we saw vote reminders going to everyone. So it was pretty clear, to use one more illustration, they got caught with their hands in the cookie jar. But I did find this that was posted by our good friend Robert Knight and actually came originally from Dr. Epstein. If you think this is the first time technology was used to change a presidential election, you would be wrong. So for those of you that don't remember your history, and believe me, I've studied a little bit of this, maybe tomorrow Brent Taylor can verify this. This actually happened in 1876. Okay, now we did not have the internet in 1876, in case any of you wonder about that. What we did have is a monopoly in Western Union, which is very interesting. So let me just read this. Vote manipulation using technology isn't new. Rutherford B. Hayes, a Republican, won the 1876 presidential election over Democrat Samuel Tilden, at least in part because of support from Western Union. I'd never seen this before. At the time, Western Union had a virtual monopoly on communications. And so as a result, this is a direct quote from the study, the company did its best to assure that only positive news stories about Hayes appeared in newspapers nationwide. That's fascinating. It also shared all the telegrams sent by his opponent's staff with Hayes' staff. So in some respects, these telegrams were then used. It's almost like stealing everybody's email. So this is happening in 1876, which reminds me a lot of what we're seeing right now. So anyway, the election dragged on for weeks, both sides actually charging voter fraud and suppression. Does that sound familiar? Again, we sometimes say there's nothing new under the sun. I'm starting to sound like Solomon here, but nevertheless. And in an article that appeared in the Washington Post, Ronald Schaefer, I guess is how he pronounced his name, said, much as President Trump is doing now, backers of Hayes, the governor of Ohio, charged the election was being stolen. The difference was, unlike now, there was clear evidence of fraud and voter intimidation. Don't you love that? Unlike now, here we go again, without evidence. One more thing that's kind of interesting. Not everyone responded to calls for unity after the divided Electoral Commission awarded the last 20 disputed votes, giving Hayes a 185 to 184 electoral college victory 4 months after the election. This thing dragged on forever. And so then angry Democrats, some people saying, does it sound familiar now, cried Tilden or blood, planned to send a threatening and bellicose mob to the national capital to see that the count is made according to their wishes. And if nothing else, you can kind of get a sense that we've been down this road before, which is one of the reasons why I think it is really time to cool the rhetoric, because the rhetoric back then was going to maybe even go and do what they can to actually begin to create, if you will, almost a civil war over the 185 to 184 electoral college vote. And in this particular case, isn't it fair? I think it's Western Union. This case was back in the Republican. That's sure I don't make a mistake on that, but I'm pretty sure. Hayes was the Republican, Tilden was the Democrat. So it's just one of those situations in which this case, the electoral misdeeds and the electoral fraud was in large part due to the fact that Western Union backed the Republican, not the Democrat. And just a little bit of a footnote in history indeed. Well, if nothing else, we will maybe tomorrow talk about some of the other issues related to the pandemic. We've got some great material there. As a matter of fact, a lot of it comes from Alex Berenson. He's been on the program with us before, but he has a new book out that deals with that, but also pointing out that a number of individuals who were supposed to take this contact trading and app, I should say, so that it would track down any person that might have been in contact with you because you had COVID-19. They're finding that most people are oddly disinterested in downloading an app that would allow the government to track every one of their moves. And so we'll talk about that tomorrow. As a matter of fact, it's so striking as to be a complete and abject failure because more than 90% of the people in Virginia, for example, have not downloaded the app, nor do they plan to do so. It's even less impressive when you realize that most of the downloads took place in the first 3 weeks. So that is an issue we'll get into. What about the issue of masks and lockdowns and some of those? So we'll cover some of the pandemic tomorrow, but then we'll also spend some time talking with certainly a couple of individuals that we've enjoyed on this program before, Doug Groteis and Brent Taylor. So both of those individuals will be with us. But if you find yourself saying, you've gone through a lot of material, I'd like to read it for myself. Well, the good news is it's all available at the website, pointofview.net, and I hope that you'll take the time to read it, print it out, maybe pass it on to some others, and we certainly make that available to you. I want to thank Andrew and Steve and Ivy for their help behind the scenes. Have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow on Point of View.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.